Before we start today's episode, I have some exciting news. From April 7th to 11th, 2025, I will be hosting a free online virtual summit called No More Heroes. This is a gathering of men's work leaders from across North America, and we're going to be diving into myth, initiation, fatherhood, archetype, and the masculine psyche as a whole. Furthermore, we'll be looking at where we are in terms of men's work today and where we ought to be going to bring forward a brighter world. If this is interesting to you, good news. It's free and open to everybody. You can find a link to reserve your seat in the description below. Now on to the show. The Smiling Human podcast is made possible by listeners like you. If you would like to experience more of these shows into the future, then please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Hello, and welcome to The Smiling Human, where collectively we evolve through inquiry. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Matt Sturm. Matt is a guide for transformational experiences utilizing coaching, psychotherapy, psychedelic-assisted therapy, sacred sexuality, breathwork journeys, and men's retreats to accomplish his goals. He runs the Living Cosmos Integral Mastery School and offers leadership coaching for men. He's the author of 2 books thus far, focused on masculinity, using archetypes and integral theory. Our conversation touches on these books and more in the world of men's work. So I hope very much that you enjoyed this conversation. Wonderful. Well, Matt, welcome to the Smiling Human podcast. I'm very excited for our conversation today.
Thank you, Oak. Pleasure to be here.
Definitely. And so I'll ask you the question I ask all guests at the head of the show. What's the last thing that made you smile?
Well, the last thing that made me smile was just now as we were prepping, you said, "Did you have your question of the week?" And I was like, oh, there's a question of the week.
Yeah.
So that's what made me smile.
Brilliant.
Most immediately. Yep.
Love it. Love it. The listeners would have had a little bit of an introduction to you on the intro of this show. However, rather than diving too much into the biography, I find myself most curious in regards to your writing. Because
Great.
what our listeners don't know is that we've had a bit of an exchange in terms of one of your later pieces on the postmodern approach to the warrior archetype. And for the listeners, Matt was generous enough to allow me to share with him my unfiltered commentary on his piece, which was quite an enjoyable practice to do. So.
Also gave me many smiles.
Good. I'm glad. Yeah, I was definitely just instant react on that kind of thing. But so you've got one book published now and another one very soon on the way, if I've understood correctly.
They are both now published.
They're both now published as of recording. Fantastic. So I would love for you to share with the audience what it is that you have brought into the world in terms of these 2 works and perhaps a little bit of why.
So there are 2 books on the topic of masculinity. The first one is called The Organic Masculine. And this one focuses on the archetype of the magician. So that one came out in 2024. Last month, I published my second book in the series called Primal Drives, and that one focuses on the archetype of the warrior. I have set myself up to write at least 2 more books on the lover and the king. And these are workbooks around masculinity, around what it means to be a man and how to show up through the filters of the archetypes. So that's very, very broad, what we're talking about.
Brilliant. And so for those who are unfamiliar in the listening audience, although I suppose there might be fewer who are unfamiliar than are familiar, the magician and the warrior, the king and the lover form what is the quaternity of the mature masculine archetypes, or so it is proposed from Robert Moore and Thomas Gillette, if I remember the names correctly. One of their seminal works by that same title. So why is it, Matt, that you started with the magician? That's one question I want to know. And sort of building off of that, can you give us an overview of what the magician is and then why you started there?
Great. I started with the magician first and foremost because that's just what makes sense in my brain. But archetypally, the magician is the one who explains things and offers us the knowledge. He's the place that we step into in order to gain the expert wisdom. And so I have a whole metaphysics and approach that I use. Part of it is with integral theory, part of it's with the archetypes. And so, in order to get the lay of the land, I decided to ask the magician to explain it to us, so to speak. In the mandala that I use, the four directions, I place the magician east. And I'll just say, like, people can place the directions and the elements and the magician, all of these things, you can place them however you like. So this is just what makes sense for me, is that the magician east is rising sun. It's the new insight coming into the world. Some folks place the magician in the west. He takes us into the realm of shadow. I think both are equally good. But for me, east, wind, intellect, magician all go together. And so in my medicine wheel, I started there. And then we're progressing from there to south, fire, warrior.
Brilliant. I have an association with the magician as being the bearer of logos.
Mm-hmm.
Each of the four carries their own different pieces. And logos is, in some sense, the masculine gift, at least from some perspectives, in respect to the feminine gift of eros and relationality. And so it does make a lot of sense why we might start with logos, because it is the ordering function in some sense. Can we concretize our ideas? Can we coalesce and solidify into something that is orderly enough that we can follow it into this progression around the mandala or around the wheel?
I totally agree. I love that. So we're taking a journey together. It's super helpful to have a map. And the map is not the terrain, but if we can align, okay, this is the direction we're going, it's going to make the journey easier.
Mm, absolutely. And it's beautiful that you say that, because depending on when this airs, there's a series of workshops being hosted here in Calgary, Alberta by myself on these four topics. And the map analogy is what I use quite readily. There's a lot of talk around, and for those who listened to my episode with Soma Miller, we talked about the performative aspect. What are we supposed to be doing as men? And when we're talking about a map, I think it really introduces a meaningfully individuated nature, which is to say, here's the lay of the land, but you, brother, are the explorer. I'm not here to tell you the way that you're going to make it to the sea. I'm not going to tell you where you want to stop or what vistas you're going to enjoy or where you should set up camp. But here's where the river is. Here are the mountains. We know that there's a bear in the woods over there. Give you as much information in terms of the topography of consciousness as it relates to masculinity, and then set the man free in order to be that sovereign explorer.
Perfect. Yes. There's a Buddhist phrase which I really love, which is 1,000 monks, 1,000 paths. And I hold these books as my field notes. This is my path. Take what works, leave what doesn't. Use it. Hopefully it's helpful for you as you make the journey.
Absolutely. Now, the shadow aspect, when you're talking about the West, I think that that's an interesting piece to relate to a single archetype. Not that you have, but you reference that some people place the magician as the introducer or the sort of guide into the shadows. The first thing that arises for me is that all of these archetypes, be it the major quaternity or any other aspect that comes through in the minor arcana, if we want to use that term, they all carry a shadow aspect to it.
Absolutely.
And so let's start with the magician. Can you speak to what the shadow element of the magician is and how you've noticed it showing up, maybe in your own field notes and your own experience, as well as your work with other men?
Yeah, for sure. So there's no one definition of the contents of the shadow, because the shadow is whatever aspects of myself that I have not fully loved and welcomed and integrated yet. And so it's any aspect of the magician that is over there, pushed away, or unrecognized yet. But I will say more broadly, the map that I give in these books So I'm trained as a somatic therapist in a modality called Hakomi. And Hakomi has these character strategies. They're kind of character strategies are these strategies that we develop as children when all of our needs aren't getting perfectly met. They're adaptations to an imperfect environment. But then as adults, they turn into these ways of relating and behaving that kind of hold us back and alienate other people sometimes. So Hakomi has 8 strategies. I think Freud was the first person to come up with a version of these, and then they've been like adapted through generations. But so the one I inherited is through Hakomi, and they have 8 of them. And as I was looking at them, I was like, oh, there's 2 for each of the 4 magician, warrior, lover, king. So Moore and Gillette in their book have 2, like the bipolar shadow of the magician. My own version of this comes from Hakomi. So one character strategy is called performing. And what that means is in order to get love and actually attention, I'm going to make a big show, a colorful display. And then I'm going to secure the resource and connection that I'm looking for. When it is integrated, the performance aspect of the magician is an incredible gift. But when I'm out here saying, hey, look at me, grabbing attention, it gets in the way. And so I would call that something that can be a shadow for the magician. The other character strategy that I map to the magician is called sensitive and withdrawn. So when the environment is too much or overwhelming, I can just kind of curl up into my own little ball. Any little input is going to be too much for me. I feel myself to be kind of fragile in a harsh world. So that's the uncooked, unintegrated part. The sensitivity and the capacity to feel and to go into these non-material realms turns into a real gift for the magician when it becomes integrated in a more resilient self that can hold and heal and recenter through the tossings and turnings of life.
Beautifully put. Thank you, Matt. There's an interesting correlation when we talk about these 2 poles because they are both compensatory and also balancing one another, right? So we're noticing that this performative aspect is expressive and the withdrawing is introverted in that
exactly.
kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
Something that I find particularly interesting in what you were speaking about in terms of the complexes and the shadow is that I wanted to introduce a delineation between the personal shadow and the collective shadow.
Great.
Because a lot of times we just speak of shadow and it's one big ball. But in actuality, at least from the Jungian point of view, which is what I am immersed in at present, is that the personal shadow is what you spoke to. These are the elements of our self-expression, our self-conception that either through our own internalization of judgment or reactivity from the environment or rejection from the environment are disowned and exiled. They are deemed unacceptable to be shown and therefore get them out of here. The collective shadow is a little bit less cut and dry. There's an aspect of our collective genetic and ancestral heritage there. So we might say it's the capacity to deceive, it's the capacity for violence, it's the capacity for ignorance, and all of the ways that we might tread those murky grounds. There are skills that are developed. It's not as though our shadow aspects are entirely unrefined, dull, and ignorant in this sense, but rather they are applying our skill and wisdom as humans in a non-life affirming direction. We're drawing ourselves away from authenticity, away from truth, away from self, away from what is actual in the being. And so I wanted to bring those 2 to light because when we're looking at either of these poles that you've put forward, we're actually looking at a very interesting intersection between the 2 of them. That is to say, how our psyche compensates for having aspects exiled finds its roots in our heritage, in our capacity to compensate, to be continually driven towards finding love, belonging, being integrated in community, feeling safe in the body. And although the personal shadow is very unique, it's still uniquely human, and therefore there's a commonality to it. So I just wanted to introduce that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And, when we look at our mythology and our popular figures in our culture, it's a good place to find the collective shadow. So like the sorcerer who's drunk on power could be a collective level shadow. Um, the bookworm who's so withdrawn into the intellect that they have lost all contact with relational fields and eros, so to speak, on the other side of your pole, would be like more of the collective level shadow.
I know it wasn't on purpose, but I definitely feel like I was a little called out there on the bookworm one.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah,
And
it's like,
actually,
go ahead.
if you listen to Robert Moore, he talks about this as one of his primary shadows, and it's hilarious how he outs himself on that
Yeah,
one as well. Yep.
yeah. Well, it's so tempting, and particularly in my own experience, the magician has been one of the archetypes that has been most easily accessible for whatever
Mm-hmm.
reason because of my disposition. That's what's come forward. I've been called a wizard for many years. There's a lake for those in Canada, Christina Lake, I used to visit with a past partner of mine, and her family owned land there. And they're all about nicknames in small town BC. And so I gained the nickname Gandalf just by being who I was. And I got to say, not a bad nickname. I carry
Not
that
bad.
with a lot of esteem. But
You're a
that's
young
that,
Gandalf. You
right?
got a few
Really
more
young.
decades.
You
Yeah.
just wait until this goes full white.
Right.
Gestures the
Totally.
beard. But that piece is quite interesting to recognize that there is the temptation to dwell exclusively in the realm of logos. And
Mm-hmm.
this might be something that we can use to bridge into a different topic as well, because eros, or that feminine or the anima from the Jungian point of view, there's an inbuilt balancing mechanism between this polarized masculinity and femininity, which we both contain. And so I'm curious about how you see femininity, or the relationship to the feminine, supporting the integration of the shadow specifically.
Yeah. Okay. Beautiful. Traditionally, like my understanding of the Jungian approach is that the first task is to begin to come into like the basics of the shadow, our unconscious material that we have repressed. And once we start to come into relationship, you can never get rid of the shadow because we're limited individuals. And so there's always going to be some unknown content, individual and collective level. But it's about being in relationship with the shadow. And then once that self starts to find, okay, here's me in relationship with the shadow, then the contrasexual inner aspect, the inner feminine, the inner masculine can start to come online more. That's my understanding of the approach. And please, if I'm off
Totally.
here,
Mm.
but the anima or the animus, that contrasexual inner part, their task is to lead us into the unknown, and they represent the unknown. And so they can help us relate with the shadow, which is partly unknown, but then they also take me from my comfortable egoic space of the known into the wider field of consciousness. They're the psychopomp, the guide in some way.
Mm. Mm. I would love to introduce a minor delineation for those
Please.
listening, that the shadow and the unconscious are two different things. The collective shadow dwells in the collective unconscious, as does our personal shadow, but that's not the only thing in the unconscious. And anima and animus were two terms that were not coined exactly by Jung. He pulled them from the Platonists, but they represent, as Matt said, the contrasexual, or the other side of the pole of the psyche. So in women, it's the animus, in men, it's the anima. And very much it is the case, as you've put it forward, that the anima is the bridge between the known, which we'll call the conscious or the ego mind, and the unknown and the unconscious, and be that the shadow or otherwise. So there's an interesting element here that ropes eros back into this, and the necessity to balance logos and eros, because anything that is not known to the ego needs to be related with. And the relating mechanism, or the relating function, as some newer schools of psychoanalysis and psychodynamics call the anima, the relating function, is responsible for bridging anything from ego and outside of ego. So that's a really interesting piece, that when we think about that as men, we go, actually, okay, so there's an intrinsically feminine aspect of my psyche that is necessary for me to come into contact with anything inside my conscious realm. That's got to give us a clue of the necessity to balance the two of them. And I would love to introduce another word here, and I'm going to try to do a really smooth bridge between ideas. So see if I get points for this segue. So we talked about logos. We talked about eros now with the relating function. I want to introduce the idea of ethos, because ethos is one of the words that I use in relationship to the warrior. So taking a short pause, I'm going to zoom out here. The good, the true, and the beautiful are the three transcendentals of Greek philosophy, and that's pathos, ethos, and logos. And so ethos is where we get ethics. It's the idea of goodness. And the way that I tie this into the warrior, and we can see how this relates to eros as well, is that the warrior is in service to ethos. It is the protector. It is the one that aligns and puts itself as the defender in some cases, not all, but in some cases, of this good, this ethos. So I'm curious how that lands for your structure.
Completely. Aligning to truth and taking action on behalf of truth is a core component of how I see the warrior, and ethos is that. Goodness, I would say, is the result through that work, through that effort. So 100% aligned for me.
Brilliant. So it's almost as though, and hopefully I hit the mark on this one, when goodness is recognized, or that highest truth rather, when truth is recognized and held as the pinnacle of value, or that thing that we place at the top of our hierarchy that we aim towards to embody, when that's actually brought through the body, not just through logos or psyche, but actually embodied through action, through habit, through practice, and through discipline, that's where we get the birth of ethos. That ethos is actually grounded directly into the soma.
Yep, right.
That you don't get ethos without action.
I completely agree. Yep, 100%.
Brilliant.
So on my mandala, I use the words magician thinking, warrior acting, lover feeling, and king being. And so for the warrior, it's through action that the realization, the actualization of the warrior happens. You can't sit back and think about warriorship. You got to do it.
There's no armchair warriors.
Right.
Right. So in following with the sort of pattern and rhythm we're rolling with, what are the two poles from the Hakomi system for the warrior of the shadow?
Okay, great. So again, tapping into the character strategies of Hakomi. One of the strategies for the warrior is called tough, generous. And so in a relational field as a small child, if you got picked on or overridden in some ways, and being vulnerable was seen as a weakness that would be exploited, then we can develop this tough affect, this big air, and we can kind of push people around. And if you do what I say, then I'm going to be generous. I'm going to share with you. The core fear here is about being abandoned. If I show myself as I am, you're not actually going to relate with me and give me love. But the self-fulfilling prophecy of this one is the more that I kind of push people around, the more challenging I make it for people to be in relationship with me. Mm-hmm. So the bully basically is the tough generous. And I just blanked on the other one. It'll come to me in a moment. But what's coming to me right now is actually sadism and masochism is another split for the warrior. So inflicting pain on others and inflicting pain on self.
Yeah, the punitive aspect. That's an interesting one with the warrior. There's something similar from what I've noticed in the work of Moore and Gillette and as well
Hmm.
as what you're bringing forward from Hakomi, which is there's the core thread is manipulation. It's indirect. And what I think is so interesting is that when we're looking at it, it's like direct and indirect, right? Because even if you're pushing people around, there could be a way that doesn't require that expression of force on someone in order to achieve your end. So you're not going the most life affirming or the most direct, the most genuine and real path towards this. You're taking one that would preserve some aspect of ego. Saying, okay, well,
Hmm.
I'm gonna put I'm a big tough guy. Ooh, okay, well, you got to do what I say, and then I'll be generous to you, right? It's like, that's extortion, and that's not great. Let's not run that,
It's
right?
manipulation. Yeah, totally.
100%. It's an attempt, and just like the sort of grandstanding and the exaggerated performance of the magician that you brought forward, in both cases, we are attempting to control the thoughts, feelings, and actions of other people rather than defaulting to authentic relation and honor of the
Hmm.
individual.
Right.
And I think that that's a core
Absolutely.
theme through all the shadow that I've seen.
And yeah, recognizing the inherent sovereignty in each being.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The second one, I got it. I just looked it up. Is called burdened enduring. Burdened and enduring. So if I grew up in an environment with overriding strong parents where my freedom came at a cost, I had to follow the rules. Otherwise, bad things might have happened. Then I developed this shell of resistance. And relationship feels like a burden. It feels like it's all my responsibility, it's all on my shoulders. And so the only way that I can deal with it is I have to endure it. I just have to get through it. And so there's this apparent contrast between freedom on the one hand and being in connection on the other hand. They seem like they are working against each other, and I can't have both.
I notice a grief arise in
Hmm.
hearing you describe that,
Hmm.
is the idea of enduring seems to be one that can characterize a lot of modern men's experience. There's a lot of that stiff upper lip, just gonna see if I can build the thickest crust around me that I can, and just grin and bear it. And that
Right.
the idea that we might actually have the opportunity to come into relation with another, be it a brother, sister, mother, child, anyone, and not have to protect ourselves in that way, not have to sacrifice something that needn't be sacrificed, or to step beyond a necessary boundary that, if held, would uphold our own wellness. It's entirely foreign. The only way that I
Hmm.
can get what I need is if I endure pain, if I give more than I get, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that mentality, I think, really is a result of being disconnected from the feeling function that you're speaking to of the lover, where we're not actually deeply willing to confront what it means to feel what's alive. And we would rather put up with what we can get.
Right. Another piece that's baked into this would be relational codependence. I have to take care of you. I'm putting your needs ahead of mine. And I'm not actually, again, it comes back to sovereignty and trusting in the relational field, trusting each member to care for themselves.
Right. Right. And so this might be an interesting segue. We can just keep rolling. Seems to be flowing pretty nicely here. That feeling function ties us into the lover as well. Right.
Absolutely.
And that is eros, but also pathos.
So
Pathos is
define pathos for us.
totally. So nowadays it's taken kind of a stinky definition because we use like
Pathological.
pathological, pathogen, it's all of this nasty
Yeah.
stuff. But originally, pathos was used to describe anything that had the capacity to elicit feeling. So in some of the earlier writings, when they were speaking about entering into the temples and beholding the statues of the gods, they would describe that as pathos, that
Mm,
those divine functions had the ability to elicit from within this awakened feeling function. This
mm.
does, in some sense, relate to the numinous, which I, numos and nuos, rather, I relate to the king, but we'll get there when we get there. But so this pathos function is recognizing that there's an aspect of our humanity, the feeling function, which is intrinsic and also outside of our control. Because when they describe it, it's elicited from the outside. Our feeling is stimulated. We can't make ourselves feel joyful. We can't make ourselves, well, you could think yourself into it a little bit, but you understand that pathos is coming through relating. It's sort of not one and the same, but connected in that sense.
Yes, love this. This is brilliant, and I'm just soaking it in. In my world, um, erotic energy is life force. It's our aliveness, and it can look sexual or sensual, but really any of the flavors of emotion or affect that we can tap into are our aliveness expressing. And like you said, we're not really choosing our emotions or what we're attracted to or our desire. We do get to be responsible, if we wish, for how we respond to those. But just the fundamental nature of being alive in this form as humans is we have eros moving through us. You know, it's inherent in the universe, but our own aliveness gets to come and express through us. And so the lover welcomes that aliveness and all its flavors in, and then gets to express it and play with it and make love to creation through it. And I love the example you gave of walking into the temple and beholding the deities and having that move the participant. That's such a beautiful example of the relational context in which this arises.
Mm. Well, in some senses, and I don't think this is too far out of the ballpark to say, but the entirety of our existence is relational. We have sense organs which tell us what is beyond our body. We have mirror neurons which allow us to attune nervous systems. We can co-regulate to make a single nervous system. You know, we have language, we have symbols, we have story to convey. Everything that we do in some real sense is some bridge between I and thou, be it the grand thou or the individuated person on the bus with me or what have you. It's all about building these bridges. And it's it's a really almost spicy thing to say that eros is inside of all of this, right? Because if I walked on the bus and it was like, oh, I'm feeling erotic, people would get off the bus. Fair enough,
Or
right?
stay with you, who knows?
Fair enough. Also true. Maybe they would stay. It's a fun bus ride. But in actuality, when we start to disentangle the idea of lust or sexuality, copulation, this very, very carnal and fundamental aspect, which is, I would say, maybe the peak expression of our relationality embodied, because we get as close to unity as possible in that moment of copulation. And then we also produce from that. So it's a generative relationality that is embodied in sexuality, which is particularly wonderful. But trees, rivers, mountains, birds, the air, the statues, music, any sort of, any bridge can have our awareness awaken to its erotic nature. I don't want to say it sort of just gets that eros, because eros is innate in it. And it has to do with our willingness to attune our, for lack of a better term, pathological nature, our feeling nature, with that channel of relation. So that arose.
I love it. So I'm going to take this into my two character strategies for the lover. How does that sound? Great. So the first one is charming and seductive. And so in this context, I need to put on a pleasant face. I need to be inviting in order to secure connection. And in this context, seduction is some kind of a mask, some kind of a white lie that I present in order to invite, in order to get someone to come into contact. And so again, there's this sense that if I show you who I really am, that you're not going to like me. I'm not going to be enough or lovable. And so I have to show you what I think you want to see in order to be in connection with you.
Mm. And again, it's like a tantalizing facade or a
Mm-hmm.
magnetic facade. And the difference between authentic charm and authentic seduction, at least in my opinion, is the end that it serves. Because again, we're taking a circuitous route when we are using the false or empty charm. We're saying, I don't feel sustained enough in myself as myself. I need this external validation. And I don't believe that I can get it any other way than through X, Y, and Z, be it the performance, be it of the magician or the force of the warrior or the
Charm.
Casanova
Yep.
vibes of the lover. When we can imagine as well in equal parts, but on the other side of the spectrum, that when I am seductive, it is towards the end of getting to know. It is actually an erotic function. And when based in authenticity, now we're suffusing that charm with the real. I'm,
Exactly. Yes.
delicately and intentionally revealing different aspects of myself that are true and perhaps timed with intention and flavor and all these things in order to move in that dance closer and closer to the one that I
Exactly.
want to connect
Mm-hmm. Dance is such a good word for it because dance has this desire baked into it, like partner dance has this desire baked into it. And so it can be seductive, it can be sexy. And when it's done for no other end than the experience itself, it's trustable and it's true and it's fun. We get to play with it. So each of these character strategies, they offer gifts when they integrate in. It's when we use them instead of being ourself that they kind of get in the way. So the next one is dependent and endearing. Mm-hmm. So this happens when I come to a sense that I'm not enough on my own. I need your support. I need your help. I need you to take care of me. To be my mom, to be my caregiver. Um, that without you, I'm lost. And so I'm dependent upon you. And then in order to secure that resource, I become endearing from kind of a smaller, softer, more childlike place. Oh, take care of me. Look how cute I am. Don't you want to just provide all the things for me? Yep. And so similarly, when it's integrated in, it's like interdependent, right? Instead of being dependent on someone, I can't stand up on my own 2 feet. We become interdependent, and there's that strong link of let's connect and let's lean on each other in healthy ways. And so there's gifts here too.
with. Absolutely. And the integration is the recognition that both what we are is acceptable and good enough and lovable, and that our natural inclination towards getting what we need is not to be shamed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yep.
On the coattails of that idea, we'll take a short break and then we'll come back with the second half of the show.
Wow, that was fast. Okay.
I hope you're enjoying the show so far. I wanted to take a brief moment to talk about just how you can help this show grow into the future. Did you know that we have an Instagram, a YouTube, and a Patreon? Probably. But if you're listening on YouTube, like many of you are, I would invite you to subscribe, to like this video if you've enjoyed it, and to leave a comment. Let me know what you thought. Let me know if you have any questions or maybe guests that you want me to interview. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Music or any other podcast platform, then please take this moment to rate the show. All of these actions go a long way to helping the Smiling Human podcast reach more people and grow into the future. Thank you so much. Fantastic. Well, we're now back with the second half of the show, which means we are in the section called the Question of the Week. This is where I invite our guest to bring forward an inquiry, something that's meaningful to them. Maybe they've thought on it, maybe they want my take on it, or maybe they believe the listeners will benefit from hearing us discuss on it. So, Matt, what have you got for us this week?
Great. This is inspired by our small foray into the inner feminine. My question is, do you, in your experience, have one inner feminine character, or are there multiple inner feminines? And have you ever experienced transgendered or other gendered beings in there as well?
Cool. So, I'll give you my understanding and my experience of the anima.
Great.
So, my understanding, as I conceptualize it based on my research and studies, is that it is a feminine principle rather than a feminine characterization, and that it has the ability to coalesce into personified notions and show up as characters in dreams, show up as moods, show up as even animals or different things in visions, imaginations, and the like. And so, for me, it shows up in lots of different characters. It shows up in
Hmm.
people that I know, it shows up in people don't know. They can be young, they can be sexy, they can be old, they can be scary, they can be elemental. I did an active imagination working specifically to integrate the anima because one of the pieces that I have been really delving into are the complexes around the anima and the relating function that have shaped how I relate with women romantically. I figured, and I hope this is right, that if I am going to enter into a sacred union, which is my wish and will, that understanding, integrating, loving that internal feminine is only going to support my capacity to hold space and nourish a woman outside of myself. So I've been
Totally
deeply,
makes sense.
right, deeply relating with this. And so I did this active imagination where I returned to a place in a dream that was quite confronting, and I stepped through this door. And when I opened the door on the other side, I had expected to meet this anima figure, and she was an elemental, like made of earth, very, very dark, like carved earth and stone of a naked female figure who was surrounded by the four winds and the four elements. And in this imagination, she actually passed right through me, like stepped through me and then stepped back. And in so doing, I was kind of scanned all the way through. Every cell, every part of my psyche, known and unknown, was made known to this anima figure. And I got to be in communion and connection and understanding, not in sort of a copulatory way, but real presence and relating with this function. And asked it questions and got to feel what it was like to relate to that feminine function internally that is far greater than my ego, that is intrinsic and universal in a way that was directly related to my personal experience of the feminine, be it wounding or conditioning and the like. So you take a lot of different faces, and that was just one of them.
I love it. Thank you for taking us into your inner world. I was getting goosebumps there as you were talking about her passing through. I was like, whoa, I feel that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah, and another piece too was I had this strong yearning because it was this epitome, this absolute pinnacle of the feminine form and power in all of its wisdom, in all of its attractiveness, in all of its generativity. And those less integrated aspects of my psyche were like, damn, I want that. Get over here, honey, or
Mm-hmm.
whatever the hell kind of funny thing it says. But what was so cool about that moment and really shifted things for me is that in this imagination, this anima figure reached out and pressed my heart back into my chest. It was
Wow.
almost like it was outside of me,
Uh-huh.
and that it was placed back in, and that desire, that yearning, that appreciation is what it turned into. So that pressing the heart back into my chest changed the yearning and desire into a grounded and embodied appreciation for that.
Mm. Yeah. Bringing you out of the realm of logos and into the realm of pathos and
Mm-hmm.
eros.
Pathos and eros,
Mm-hmm.
exactly.
Yep.
Exactly right. And so, what about you? What has been your experience with anima and this female function? I know I didn't get to your other question in terms of
Oh,
whether or not
no.
there's been two
But
genders, but
actually, your clarification helped me a lot. What I heard you say is that there's one principle, and then it can have different personifications. It can show up as all these different characters. And I often hear people talk about the anima or the animus as like it's one thing, it's one. And so that's a super useful nuance for me. And I have the same nuance in terms of like inner children. We talk about my inner child like it's one being, but there are many different inner children in the landscape in there. So that's where I'm connecting it to. And so thank you. That makes so much sense for me. in my world, there are multiple different inner feminine characters, mother figures. I have a sister who's a very close age to me. I have like sister, sexy inner feminine, earth goddess inner feminine, like all like a whole rich tapestry. And I do think that from my chosen masculine vantage point, that I understand myself masculinely in context relationally with the feminine as a principle. And so the masculine and feminine polarize with each other, and then they know each other through that exchange. But the instances of showing up of what my masculine looks like and what the feminine internal or external looks like are always shifting and changing. So in this context, it looks like, me opening a door and there's a giant stone figure of a naked woman. Cool. That's the context of the polarity happening in that moment. Yeah. And similarly, rich inner landscape of getting to know the feminine.
Mm.
Mhm.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note that these figures are tied into the compensatory function of the psyche. That when we have any sort of disbalance or incongruency, perhaps internally, be it a result of shadow repression or ego inflation or alienation, what have you, that the anima, not the only thing, but the anima can show up as a compensating force. So it's not just we have unconscious compensations of the alter ego or the shadow self, but we also have a function that is constantly seeking to promote a homeostatic balance. Not that it's stagnant, but it's just trying to keep things level. I want to introduce an idea to you that I think is important to note. It relates to anima, it relates to pathos, it relates to eros, and also the sort of unity between poles. And I'll lay the land here. A lot of the work that followed from Jung in terms of Ettinger and Hillman looked at eros and anima as the underlying function of all creation. So what it did is it said that the creation that we live in, all of psyche, matter, it is eminent from a matrix, mater, mother. And what that did is it's a very interesting book written by Eugene Monich called Phallos. And he speaks about how this sort of primatization, this elevation of the feminine, actually is a precursor to the tyranny of boys, as Robert Moore would call it, or this toxic patriarchy aspect that we see when the shadow masculine is allowed. And I'll tell you why it is, and then I'll introduce how Phallos plays into all of this. The
Please,
idea
this is
is that,
fascinating.
right, I was like, whoa, this is mind-blowing. The idea is that if we say that the feminine is fundamental, then the masculine, at least in some reasonings, I'm not saying I put this forward, but in this literature, is an evolution out of it. Okay, so that's one piece. So there's an evolution that is away from the feminine that is the masculine. So there's a differentiation, there's a hierarchy in terms of levels of development of the psyche. That creates subordination. Not a great thing to do. Secondly, the understanding that the hero's journey is one that requires slaying the mother, this separation from. That only gives us half the idea, because now not only do we have masculinity as something that has evolved out of the feminine, but it's something that we have to, like, masculinity needs to get away from the feminine. That the feminine is not only generative, but is something that needs to be distanced in order for masculinity to make any sense. And the reason I say it's half the battle is, at least in the ideas of Eugene Monich, is that just like we have masculine and feminine, animus and anima, day and night, we have a patrix to the matrix, which is the phallos energy, that there is a generative masculine pole to the underlying energies of generation and life. And that we need to understand both of these, particularly as men, because that is one of the channels that we can use to activate the divine masculine life force energy inside of us. That is what animates the phallus to rise. That is what is imbibing the muscles of the warrior when it is acting in alignment with ethos. It's phallos. It's not eros. it's not ethos, it's actually pathos. It is a fundamental creative and generative force that is of the masculine pole. So I wanted to pitch that to you.
Cool. Fascinating. I haven't gone into this material and I love it. And as you're talking about where I was going with this is individually for men, male bodied, socialized men, we are born of the feminine body and then come into our own bodies, and then we have to individuate from. And so there's like the cosmic level of matter going through evolution, and then there's the personal level of, at least for our bodies and our psyches, how we deal with our own actual mothers as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting that you say, we're born of the female body. Yes, and not without the father.
Totally.
And what Eugene points in is that we can easily miss the phallos principle in birth because it's present at the moment of copulation and then disappears from our view because the child gestates in darkness. So we don't see how it might generate. We see mama, we see the womb carrier, we see that sacred portal, and we're like, yeah, amazing. Where the hell is phallos? where is it? Well, it turns out that the popping in and out of consciousness, the making known and hiding away, which we might even say is mirrored in the rise and fall of the erection, is the nature of phallos. It is to say that we show up, it shows up, and then disappears with no capacity for us to control it, which is a really interesting point to make. And one of the things that I've been toying with in No More Heroes, both the workshops here in Calgary and the online summit, which you'll be a part of, and hopefully people who are listening to this after the fact are able to go and find at the requisite links, is that not only do we need to move away from mother in order to individuate as masculine, but we actually have to move towards phallos. We have a direction to go to. And to tie one other piece in, when you asked me about whether or not there's any sort of, I'm going to use the word hermaphroditic or bi-gendered characters inside the psyche, absolutely. And what that represents is the individuated, the whole aspect. This is at least what Jung would say. When we have a creature, I say creature because it's like sometimes they're quite mythical, at least in my experience, who carries both the masculine and the feminine as one whole, that's integration. That can represent the archetype of the self rather than anima or ego or shadow.
Love it. Yes. Oh, cool. I'm so happy you picked up that piece. Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. Oh, and there's so much good stuff in here. So one of the things that I'm recognizing that you carry and that you transmit is this sense of masculine generativity as the potential to be inherently good. It's not always expressed in healthy ways, but that there is a core here of creativity and spreading the seed and impregnation and rising in our column. That is part of creation and that is like a good thing for masculinity. And that's one of the things that I love, finding these little nuggets and how other people talk about it, because I think it's one of the keys to the dialogue right now is finding those healthy expressions of masculinity to create the new vision of what it means to be masculine.
At the center of that, at least in my conception, is, as you mentioned, generativity. Another way that we can phrase that is it life-affirming?
Language I use, 100%.
Right? Yep. And people might be curious, what the heck does it mean to be life-affirming? Well, it's really easy to tell. If you do something, say something, or are around something that makes you feel weak, that runs counter to your sense of well-being, that's a really easy way to identify if something's not life-affirming. And the shadow actions of, say, the warrior, the lover, or the magician that we've spoken to so far are not life-affirming in the very sense that they neglect to acknowledge and honor the sovereignty of the other. And sovereignty is a natural principle. That is to say that Our individuation has a divine and sacred aspect to it. And when we recognize that in honor, that piece is life affirming. It's like when we say namaste, that's an example of that generativity. And when it's not present, this is where we get the tyranny of boys, as I love that phrase, as Moore puts it. We get the sexual violence, family violence, domination, tyranny, greed, all the things that are associated with the quote toxic masculinity, which is not a phrase that I use. Behaviors are toxic, mentalities are toxic, but masculinity is an expression of phallos. And phallos itself is a pure divine principle. And I think we need to extricate those two. Say, what are we looking at, right? We're looking at behavior and mentality that is being carried by men who are not connected to that divine principle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm going to translate this into my own language. So my first book is titled The Organic Masculine. And the way I define the organic masculine is life-affirming masculinity. And there's a quote that I absolutely love from Janine Benyus from Biomimicry. It says, "Life creates the conditions that are conducive to life." When we are acting, when the masculine is acting in ways that are conducive to life, that's it. Another quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer, which I really associate here, is all flourishing is mutual. When we are all flourishing together, that's that expression, the masculine in the expression of generativity. I also agree with you. I don't use the term toxic masculinity except just to acknowledge how it's in the dialogue around, because there's not actually a definition that is meaningful and objective for what that even is. In my second book on the warrior, I talk quite a bit about violence. And violence is harm that's caused interpersonally or collectively. And we can really define how is this harm caused. We can measure it. We can say, okay, that's it. And when I looked at statistics around violence in the world, I was blown away that the vast, vast majority of it is caused by men and males. So there's something that we can talk about. Toxic masculinity is a little bit more squishy, and there's a level of blame involved, baked into it, of this is someone who is a perpetrator and there's a victim to toxic masculinity. And that gets stuck in what's called the drama triangle for me. And it's a disempowered frame to understand the issue.
It's worthwhile to note, too, that the majority of violence, yes, is perpetuated by men. And it's also a small majority of men who find their temperament at the extreme polarity of masculinity that actually perpetuate the majority of it. It's not as though
Absolutely.
Violence is actually evenly distributed. Everybody's, a little bit violent. It's not quite that sense. It's that there is a correlation to what are typically hyper, or I don't even know if hyper masculine is the right term, but very exaggerated sort of 99th percentile types of temperament, which are highly disagreeable and very low in compassion. That's psychopathy. It's violence. It's the desire and the will to power. It is a will to dominate without any checks or balances on a psychological perspective. And it's interesting when you talk about blame too, because one of the pieces that I wish I heard more of in the modern discourse is this razor thin edge of culpability. What is our responsibility? Responsibility and culpability. That's the razor's edge. In some sense, some of the less nuanced and hyperbolic discourse around toxic masculinity blames all men, or even most men, or blames the characterization of men and masculinity as the root of this potential violence. When I don't think it's justified to put blame on all men, but I do think it is justified for all men to recognize and be held responsible for their role in holding themselves and other men accountable when it comes to those types of violent and shadow actions. That is to say that if every man ever spoke up against moments of violence throughout history, we wouldn't have it anymore. But it's our willingness to allow cowardice in ourselves to continue that allows this violence against women and children and other men for that matter. So that's a piece. I don't know if I have a
I love
solution
it.
there, but
Yeah, it's a topic that I go into in my book, and which has become fascinating to me. Another frame to look at what you were just talking about of culpability is pacifism, which is saying, I'm just going to avoid the conflict, versus nonviolence. And for me, nonviolence requires me to meet in myself, I have the capacity to cause harm. The worst atrocities that I see in the world, if I was in a different situation under different circumstances, I could also do that. And that there are wild, uncontained forces in here, and in the right circumstances, they might come out and I might actually strike someone. In recognizing that, then I can begin to bring compassion into my behaviors and how I relate to other people's behaviors. So nonviolence is not a pushing away, a pacifism of no, let's just avoid the hard things in the world. It's choosing to stand in that fire, the fire of truth, and to meet my own and others' capacity for harm, to bring it to the light and thereby purify it.
I'll offer you one step, and I won't say further,
Please.
but one step in some direction,
Sure.
which is the movement from nonviolence to non-aggression. And
Okay.
this is an interesting one that got
Interesting.
introduced to me. I don't know exactly where I fall in it. It's not that this is constituting my particular worldview, but I was speaking with Hazel Sage. She runs Elemental Society. I had her on the podcast as well. I think the episode's coming out after this one. And she was attempting and is attempting to write an oath for people who are working to build a better society. And one of the pieces they put in was non-aggression. I thought this is very interesting because violence, look, if I'm being aggressed upon, violence might be my only option. If my children are being terrorized or attacked, violence is an option. And violence is an option I'm going to take if it means protecting my wife and children. But it means something different than if I go out and go, you know what? That neighbor's got a really annoying dog. Next time I see the dog, I'm kicking the dog. That's aggression, right? That is using and leveraging the option of violence towards those selfish ends rather than towards, like we said before, ethos, towards a positive end. It's hard to say, violence towards a positive end. But when we talk about defense of the innocent, I think that is something that we need to speak more on. I don't have a very firm understanding because it's so bloody nuanced and so many different facets to it. But that's something I want to bring into the conversation, is the idea of
Beautiful.
non-aggression.
So what I'm hearing, I'll say from the academic research that I've read, there's a distinction in the literature between violence and aggression, where aggression is the impulse and violence is the harmful action, the result, which is different than the way that you're using these terms. What I do want to stand in favor of is that our instinctual urges to be ferocious, to hunt or to feel hunted, like those aspects of us are not going away. And they offer incredible gifts when we can integrate them. And so instead of calling those aggressive, I'll just say our instincts, right? These primal drives is the name of my book. These primal drives, we want to turn towards them and become intimate with them so that we can harness them and then in our sovereignty choose how to behave, how we show up.
It's reminding me of a quote that Jordan Peterson said on Joe Rogan's podcast many years ago when he was describing what meekness meant. Have you heard this one before?
No, I don't think so.
He was speaking about how meekness is sometimes conflated with harmlessness and inability to do harm, when in actuality, it's not those who are without swords that are meek, but it's those who have swords, know how to use them, and keep them sheathed are the meek.
Beautiful. And I want to segue that right into the warrior initiations, which you probably know very well from the Iron John story. So the warrior goes through 3 colors. He's the white knight, the red knight, and the black knight. And the idea here, red, white, black. I think I said that reversed. The idea here is that we start off red, meaning passion and blood, and there's just so much testosterone that we inherit. And we go off into the world and we're a little bit reckless because we don't know how to use our swords well. And then the second phase in the initiation into warriorship is to become a white knight, which means finding your principles, finding the ideals to stand for. So chivalry or the Bushido code, this code of ethics that we uphold as something worth defending and protecting. But even that code can turn into a type of fundamentalism, and it can lead us off track. And so the final initiation of the warrior through this mythic story is the Black Knight. And the Black Knight is the warrior who has met his own shadow, his own capacity for the worst kinds of behavior. He knows what it is and means to take a life. And through that, he practices restraint. He knows that he must wield a sword because we all have one, but he knows what it costs to use it.
The introduction of perspective that begets wisdom.
Yeah.
I think that that's the key for initiation. It's the gift that comes from initiation, not just warrior's initiation, but all initiation is that intrinsic shift in perspective that begets wisdom.
Yeah.
I appreciate that you brought that forward, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this will air before the No More Heroes Summit. So for listeners who want to hear more from Matt and more from Matt and I, that's an opportunity to do it. The links will be in the description, pre and post launch. And if you are curious about diving more into Matt's book, more into Matt's work, picking his brain and benefiting from the wisdom that he's gleaned from his initiations, Matt, can you tell the people where they can find you?
Yeah, most of my resources are on mattsturm.com. But if you type in organic masculine or primal drives to any place where you would purchase a book, including Amazon, you will find both of those books readily available.
Excellent. Well, Matt, this was like over way before I even anticipated it.
We only just got started. Yeah, we could
nerd
out for a long time, I feel like. This is super fun.
Absolutely. I appreciate all of your perspectives, your receptivity, and your own generativity that you've brought to this space, both for my own selfish means as well as for the benefit of the listeners. So.
Well, thank you, Oak. Real pleasure. And your generous spirit shines through, and it's a gift for all of us.
And that concludes this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. Thank you so much for listening. But before you go, I have 2 invitations for you. The first invitation is to receive a free gift. I've created a free insight journal. This is a 30-day self-reflection and introspection journal that you can download at no cost in the description below. Go have a look and join the journey. The second invitation I have for you is, if it feels within your means and possible for you, then please head over to patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Becoming a patron will give you access to perks like behind-the-scenes footage and access to live Q&As with me monthly. You also get voting privileges to help pick new guests or to help guide other episode content. Truly, the support of listeners like you, paid or unpaid, goes a long way. So if you could like, share, subscribe, and give a rating on the podcast app, all of that goes a long way. Thank you to each and every one of you who's been on this journey with me. See you again soon.